long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Will Miller, a political scientist now employed as Associate Vice President with Campus Labs. And joining me again today is Zach, our new Anarco-Communist friend. Zach, glad to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Will.
So let's start with an issue that I think might be of interest to you, given some of your political leanings and political background, and that's what's going on in Venezuela, where obviously we still have an internal battle going between Nicolas Maduro and Juan Guaido, and then obviously we have the impact of the United States' influence on this in terms of recognition by President Trump and now being echoed by many in D.C. So what's your view on what's happening in Venezuela? What background do you want to provide for listeners on this, Zach?
Well, I would like listeners to be conscious of previous U.S. interference in Latin American politics. It's the place that we feel the most comfortable intervening. It's the place that we've had the most success historically, and it's also the place that has rebuked us the hardest most recently. Maduro, for what it's worth, I don't support Maduro, but I do support the movement that he is in front of. And what's going on right now is, one, Trump wants another win, so he's pushing for this. But we're openly calling for a coup. We are funding military attempts. We're definitely funding attempts to get military officers to lead a coup. We are telling a sovereign nation that we do not recognize its president. We just recognize the opposition leader, which of course it's such a meaningless statement. Like, oh, well, this guy opposes the president. He's the president now. I mean, it's comical to think that anyone takes that seriously. And you've got a handful of our allies jumping in on this one. It's really disturbing to me because while Venezuela has problems, it also has a ton of positive things that no one ever mentions. Their human development index is high. They've built millions of homes for the poor. The Bolivarian Revolution has provided a lot of gains. I'm looking here, more than 5 million computers, over 100 million textbooks to students across the country. More than 20,000 schools have received new computer equipment. Sixth in the world in terms of enrollment in primary education. Latin America has historically been very damning to people of different sexual orientations, to the indigenous communities, to women, and they have made huge strides as far as those rights are concerned. So Maduro inherited a government that had made a ton of strides, and he's obviously, like any government, he's not the sole participant in governing and in executing policy. And so a lot of the people have continued these positive strides, but they obviously have shortages. They're having hunger. They're having very dire crises at the same time. And so we have decided that we're going to attempt to institute a coup. We're going to slander them internationally. We're going to put some of the craziest people we have on the job. Elliot Abrams has been added to the coup team, who, of course, was part of Iran-Contra. And he was detrimental to Latin America throughout the 80s, and he was pardoned by George W. Bush. We've also got John Bolton telling Maduro that he needs to accept Guaido's offer of amnesty or find himself in the Guantanamo Bay prison, which is, of course, terrifying to hear. Federal national.
I thought we closed it.
What's up?
I thought we closed it.
Oh yeah, I think so. I think it's closed. I think Cuba's totally okay with that. You know, they've taken it back over and they're now using the port that we've occupied for 100 years. Yeah, no, it's very scary to me. And like I said, I don't personally support Maduro. I do support the movement, and it's just such an undermining of legitimacy.
But let me ask you about that, Zach, because here's where I get torn on this. Because I agree with you. Face value, I'm normally opposed to us going into other countries and telling them what to do. But in this case, the National Assembly used the Venezuelan Constitution to declare Maduro an illegitimate candidate. and vacated the presidency. So where does the legitimacy fall when it's both us taking an action on an executive level, but a country's popularly elected legislative body having previously taken kind of the same action?
I agree. It's a tough question, and it's not one that either you nor I nor anyone in the U.S. should make.
True.
That is a
Agreed.
Venezuelan sovereign issue, and we love to talk about democracy, except for when it's really in power. And Venezuela has had some of the most highly monitored, cleanest elections in the world. They're one of the most monitored places, and it was all because they called Chavez illegitimate. Well, fact is he wasn't. The most recent election has had some issues, and there's legitimacy questions there. But again, we're just beating the war drum because they think this could be an easy win. There are tons of quote unquote dictators that we do business with that are not of the left that we have no issue with. So this is, I think they think that Venezuela's current government will fall soon, and they'd like to be seen as part of it. They'd like to get back in on the oil game. They would like those resources that they've been denied for so long. There's loans to give to those people,
Yeah, that is a factual point to this. I guess where I just get confused is, I look at Venezuela today and I look at Venezuela under Chavez, especially in the later part of Chavez's reign, and it feels less threatening to me.
Why is that?
And I can't pinpoint why that is, but I feel like, even with Maduro, there was at least less concern for the U.S. perspective. Was that a fair assumption by me, or is that something that, what has changed that's led to this push now versus previously when it felt like there was a more direct threat? It was definitely more directed. What's caused that?
I don't believe that there was a threat. The only threat that Chavez offered to the United States was that he paid off all of the IMF loans. I believe Venezuela was the first country to ever fully pay off their IMF loans in Latin America. They were crushed by them. There was never a threat to the United States from Venezuela, in my opinion. We have been an open threat to them. It was funny because Maduro kept saying that there was going to be a U.S. coup or that the U.S. wanted him dead. People were like, oh, you're just paranoid. And it turns out, yeah, there was, and there still is. So, Chavez pulled the country up pretty severely. And unfortunately, like so many other nations, they have largely based their economy on one commodity. Now, through global machinations, that one commodity for Venezuela is no longer sufficient. So they're in trouble. I do find that interesting, though, that you considered Chavez a threat, whereas now maybe it's just because Chavez was more visible.
I think Chavez he spoke more threat language. I think Chavez was much more direct, and again, maybe not direct threats, but the language of the allies, I think, just put him into a grouping that made the appearance of threat, to be honest.
Yeah, sure. Venezuela, made the unspeakable mistake of being allies with Russia and Iran, and now, of course, we want to be allies with Russia, but not Iran. They're similar to Cuba. Socialist nations are under constant attack. They always have been since 1917 when the Russian Revolution happened. It's been an immediate threat as soon as it comes into place. And so they took action to increase their resource base and their allies, and whether or not they chose people that we considered at the time at least enemies, right? Whether they did that as a provocation of the United States is a question or not. But there's also, we've got a lot of pull with other countries, and when we tell them not to do business with people, that's what happens. I don't think that there was ever a threat to the United States from Venezuela. If anything, right now is the closest that we would come to a threat, just because we're openly beating the war drum.
And again, I mean, for me, it just comes back on this one where I recognize that there's a disconnect here where I would argue that it's not that I have personal stake in this either way. I don't think this directly impacts the average American life in any way, shape, or form. I would sit there and say that understanding what Venezuela has done in the National Assembly makes me feel like they've followed the process laid out in their constitution, which would lead to Guaido being the president. But then I also recognize, me saying that another country should follow popular sovereignty after watching the Electoral College save Trump into the presidency seems counterintuitive or just just not correct. So it's kind of another one that personally tears me both ways. But again, to your point, I agree. I don't think it should be necessarily up to us sitting on the outside to make these decisions. When I look at it as the National Assembly has sat there and done this, let them fill the power vacuum. Let them fill the gap. Let them kind of choose how that works. If they want to talk about rule of law, let's make sure that they're following their own. And the best way for them to do that, as you pointed out, is for them to actually control that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the constitutional intricacies of Venezuela. I'm not overly familiar with how their government is constituted. So if what you're saying is correct, and according to their previous legislation and constitutions, et cetera, if that's what should happen, then that's what should happen. But this similar scenario happens all the time and we don't get involved. And I think that's what should happen. Now, if they start, I don't think this would ever be the case, but if they started slaughtering people, yeah, perhaps we step in. But, cries about humanitarian crises in Venezuela of recent were never heard in the 80s and 90s when the populace was by far worse off in general, and we were profiting from, extortion loans.
Yep. Speaking of potential socialist presidents, let's switch gears here for a minute.
Speaking of illegitimate future elections.
Obviously, we know that Mike and Jay on the show talk pretty regularly about 2020 and some of the presidential candidates and the hopefuls and what's happening in the race. But obviously, Zach, having you on the show, bringing a different view from the left, I thought it'd be especially important that we kind of talk about this today. And I haven't really had a chance to weigh in on this during the show yet either. So looking at 2020 and when we look at the candidates, who do you like? Who do you not like? I mean, let's just start big picture in terms of the folks we already know are running, the folks we think might be running. What do you see the field looking like?
I'm already exhausted thinking about it. I just want to state that, our electoral campaigning process is unlike anywhere else in the world. Lots of countries limit it to 2 months, or even less. And I'm a big proponent of that. But that being said, the ones that are currently in the race, whatever that even means, I like Elizabeth Warren. I don't think she could win, but I've enjoyed her policies and politics in the past. I don't like Cory Booker. Kamala Harris is interesting, but I don't like prosecutors. While I would really enjoy for Bernie to be involved with this, I've been a huge Bernie supporter since way before 2016. I followed him for a very long time. I don't want Bernie to run because I don't think old people should be running the country again. I think youth is what needs to be up there. So hopefully some more youthful, progressive, non-standard, non-typical Democrats throw their hat in the game. I also think.
Who would you see that being like? Just out of curiosity, before you continue with your list.
Yeah, I really don't know.
That's what I'm trying to think of a name. Like, I mean, is it Beto? Is it?
I don't know. People love him. He's fairly standard for me. A lot of the people that I like are very recent. The woman from Detroit, I really enjoy her. I can't give you an answer, honestly. Which is part of the problem, right? Like, our options are being forced on us as like, oh, well, it's going to be Joe Biden because we've got to get back to the center. No.
What about somebody close to you? What about Sherrod Brown?
I don't know.
I share those feelings on shared ground. That's a perfect sound for it.
Yeah, I don't know. I would say that Beto's not a bad bet as to someone that gets fairly far in this race. But I don't know. I'm interested to see what Bernie does, and hopefully he doesn't run. Hopefully he's part of a very integral part of someone's campaign. And I would, based on the similarity that I have with his choices in the past, I would imagine that whoever he gets behind, if it's not himself, will probably be who I align myself with.
Got it. And let me ask this, because this is always the question, and this is what we hear from a lot of readers, or listeners, that listeners, especially on the far left, looking at pro-Bernie, feel like they're not recognized by the traditional Democratic Party, and that, as you mentioned, that the electoral system almost works against them in a lot of ways in terms of minimizing the impact. And they'll make the points that, more Americans agree with Bernie Sanders and AOC than they do the average Democrat or Republican. They just can't get a candidate past the point that they need to actually be successful in American elections. Would that make you feel like your voice had been heard if that's what you end up with candidate-wise in terms of picking who a proxy basically chooses to support?
More so than if the DNC picks it. Yeah, I suggest to people all the time that if they're registered Democrats, they should leave. They should leave the party. They should make those numbers dwindle, and they should join alliances that they more accurately align with. I think the two-party system in general is garbage. I wish the Libertarian Party was stronger. I wish the Green Party was stronger. And, Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, which AOC is a member of, I think it's a great option. It's really been revitalized since Trump left. Its numbers have I don't know. I bet before Trump got elected, their membership numbers were like 5,000, and I bet now they're close to 60 or 70 or something. There are real efforts taking place, and I think that people, if they are on the left, should leave the Democrats to, one, send a sign, right? Send a message. And two, I think they should properly align with the people that they actually support, and then use that to put pressure on the Democrats.
Yeah. And again, it's just, for me, when I look through this list, as somebody who, as of today, will likely end up voting again for Trump unless something jumps off the page. It's just a list. There's so many names and there's so many different pieces here. I know a lot of people don't like Cory Booker. I know from what you've said, from a policy perspective, you don't. It's ironic that Cory Booker is actually the Democrat that I probably like the most, and it has nothing to do with politics. It's personal. I had a good friend and a former colleague and mentor, and he spoke on my colleague's campus, and my colleague's wife at the time was in the hospital undergoing chemo and couldn't attend, and Cory Booker called her from campus and then continued to call her afterwards and follow up, and I just saw some actual care in Cory Booker there. But again, politics and policy-wise, definitely lots of problems. Sherrod Brown, in all honesty, I actually like Sherrod Brown, but I just can't like anybody that stands next to Tim Ryan and doesn't laugh in his face constantly, because Tim Ryan is just such a disgrace that it makes it incredibly difficult. Julian Castro, who I think, again, was a rising star, but kind of saw that fall back. Gillibrand, Klobuchar, all of those groups. Again, it's the question of what differentiates. I'm with you. Kamala Harris is definitely going to be a thorn for Republicans. I don't think she has any chance of being successful. And I think what's going to work against Harris is the fact that she just says things in a way that I think even have some Democrats, kind of like AOC at times, being like, not quite sure that's how we would have delivered that exact message. It could have been possible. It's just such a laundry list right now. And the thing about it to me is Democrats have not learned from watching Republicans kill themselves in primaries. Because if they want to know how Donald Trump got to be the Republican nominee, it's because they started with a list of 20 people that were all basically the same. And they beat each other up, and then Donald Trump emerged.
Yep.
Which, again, that's got to be on somebody's mind at the DNC, that if we do this and we self-attack, somebody's going to show up at the end and walk through the edge. And again, I think that's when, with Joe Biden, that might be what ends up happening. That that all of these Democrats sit there and beat each other up for a year, and then Joe Biden emerges as the clean, grandfatherly, I will bring us together and go beat the evil troll kind of mindset, which, again, I mean, that kind of fits the Joe Biden life approach, too, of I'll get beat down and then show back up and just amaze you.
Yeah, as much as I miss Joe Biden's antics and quality humor during the Obama years, I do not want him running. I do not want him part of this. Your point about Trump, it was no surprise to me, really, that he won. It was a little bit of a shock, just the sheer reality crumbling in front of my eyes, but it's no surprise to me that enough people had a message that resonated with his. And if the Democrats don't realize that populism has to be part of this next push, then they're dumber than I thought they are.
And again, I would have to say that if I was voting for anybody today, I'd be looking at Pete. I'm just going to say Pete, our South Bend mayor, who thinks he's ready for the White House.
Hey, if South Bend is not a microcosm of this country as a whole, I don't know what is.
Yeah, again, who knows? He's right. It would be elite for anybody. There's no denying that. But
at least an Indianian could hand it off to another
Hoosier.
A Hoosier.
Hoosier to a Hoosier. And I think I will say that about 2020. I think that is still the one thing that has not been talked about very much that I think will be interesting is if Mike Pence sticks around for a second run.
Yeah, or if Mike Pence just overthrows the government and institutes theological rule.
Yeah, which again, so I always tell my Democratic friends, you may not like Donald Trump, but I'm not sure you'd like Mike Pence that much better.
Yeah, when Trump got elected, me and a bunch of my friends it was like, well, do we want an idiot that can't get anything done, or do we want, in my eyes, an absolute psychopath that's probably much more calculated than Trump is?
And again, I mean, it's one I have problems with some of Pence's policies, but from a government standpoint, obviously I think he brings some strength, and I think he was a great choice by Trump. I look at this Democratic list for 2020, I'm still kind of staring at it while we talk, and I mean, I'm with you. It's the fact that you like Elizabeth Warren is probably the exact reasons why I don't like Elizabeth Warren. The consumer protection side, I'm still a big fan of free will, and if you start racking up debt and sign for some of these predatory loans, you've signed for them knowingly, or at least somewhat knowingly, and I just don't see the problem there. But it's just a list of there's nobody that even is somebody who's not sold on Trump that says I could get behind this person and feel better and feel like they're playing to the moderate. I want to know which Democrat is going to come out and play to the moderate right, because they're up for the taking, and somebody has to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that the person that does end up being the best choice in my eyes waits a while, because like I said, the amount of time that we allow for campaigning is just an increased amount of time for you to say something stupid that,
or your book picture to show up.
Yeah, for sure. But, Howard Dean got enthusiastic and he lost the lead because he was happy. Yeah. I mean, get the hell out of here, right? Like, so I hope whoever does decide to join that I support is calculated about when they enter. Let some yearbook photos crop up for the next 5 months or something, and then make some moves.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think don't even get me started, and we won't talk about this, we'll switch, but the fact that this still so overemphasizes Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina through nothing but political tradition versus actually microcosms of the United States, it just drives me crazy.
I can't stand the electoral
We got to get to the battleground states early if we're going to continue with this system. I mean, let's start with Texas, Florida, and Ohio and really shake these things out in meaningful ways versus shaking hands in Ames, Iowa. No offense to Iowa State.
Shout out to Iowa.
Yeah, shout out to Iowa. You care. You matter for the next 2 years again. So switching gears, one last kind of piece I wanted to talk to you, Zach, is obviously with you coming on and with your political leanings, we've had a fair number of listener questions kind of come in because, as I mentioned, a lot of progressive listeners have been waiting for this moment, and a lot of right-leaners have been waiting for this moment as well for different reasons, as you learned on the Facebook page. So we have a few questions that I just kind of want to walk through with you and see how you'd kind of respond here in our last 7 or 8 minutes. And I'd actually start with a question from a listener that I think is the fairest way to begin. And this listener asked for perhaps a discussion about what you view anarcho-communism as being and what you view it as not being. And they add the caveat that some would argue that anarcho-communism was never actually intended to work on a larger national scale. So how do you respond when you hear thoughts like that or criticisms like that?
Well, first of all, anarcho-communist is just the easiest buzzword that we were able to come up with for my beliefs. Again, I think Marxian economics is the most accurate form of economics to identify contradictions and problems and predict future crises in capitalism. As for why, just one background beyond the sheer believability of what I read as far as Marxian economics is concerned, I find it interesting that the biggest names in Marxian economics are highly trained and well-versed in all forms of economics. Whereas if you read neoliberal, classical, etc. economists, they're not schooled in leftist economics. They just, dismiss it outright. So I immediately see an imbalance there between the two different economists, right? I see the Marxists as having a better overall understanding and comprehension of opposing economics. So that's why I'm Marxian in my economics. And so that's what leads towards the communist label, right? Like we largely associate Marxists with communism with Marxists, etc. I've also been very influenced by people in the anarchist sphere, Noam Chomsky in particular. And I consider myself anarchist in some ways because I like personal liberties. I enjoy the organization at a smaller level, which is probably what this listener is referencing, of non-hierarchical grassroots organization. Now, bouncing back to the more rigid socialist, communist, Marxist elements of my beliefs, I don't think everything can be solved by local and small and non-hierarchical. So, in my mind, I think anarcho-communist is a decent description because I want a combination of both classical, I'm very sympathetic and I'm very sympathetic with the Leninist and Trotskyist line of Marxist thought, and a lot of that is what leads me towards large-scale governmental coordination with as much smaller anarchist-based non-hierarchical organization at levels that don't necessitate large scale. So that's why I see it as a combination of both. It has to be, for progression in my eyes, there has to be massive change on both levels. People have to organize themselves, but we also have to take control of the largest sectors of the economy and of the government in order to make real strides on things, especially things like global warming and climate change. Without massive governmental interference, nothing's going to get done, and then the worst will possibly happen.
Now, the one thing about that is, you're focusing more on the economic side, but a term like that, and again, I know that's a term that we're using for you, even though there's more depth to what your belief system shows. A lot of folks affiliate that with a sense of acceptability of violence. Do you fall on that side in terms of getting to this endpoint? And sort of the question is, if not, how do we get to it? We had a listener write in talking about, what do you see as a viable transition from our capitalist system into that type of economic system without leaving destruction in its path? So how do we get there?
Well, you say destruction, I say progress.
The listener says destruction.
The royal you. I'm not not a pacifist in that I don't believe force should ever be used. I think force should definitely be used in order to bring about a better situation for the majority of people. What constitutes violence is a very big question. I would say that the inability of most Americans to ever really raise themselves to a level of existence and control of their own economic and social life based on the inequities that we've got as far as wealth and power are concerned, that's a form of violence to me. So I'm opposed to that violence. And if it takes some other form of violence to get rid of that, then I support it. But that's not saying that I'm suggesting to go out and be physically violent to people. But, this country loves to act like they respect private property. And so anything that constitutes the detriment of private property of the wealthy, people would see as violence, and I'm all for that violence. I think it's funny, like the Black Bloc and Antifa, people are trying to paint these people as these crazy, violent protesters. You got to understand that, protest at this point, you're supposed to go to the police and get your permit, and then you're going to walk down these prescribed streets, and that's not protest. That is a castrated version of something that used to be called protest. So you've got people destroying, private property, breaking out Starbucks windows. One, they're insured, so who really cares? And two, it's because we're not allowed to protest in any other meaningful way, so they take direct action, and I support that as well.
Again, I guess the pushback again is, what does that mean for order? What does that mean for the individuals who could be impacted that aren't? Again, it comes back to me, and we've talked about consumption on the other show, but it comes back to, Starbucks may be insured, but what does that mean in terms of what it causes as a trickle down? Where does it stop between then meaningful protest and individuals taking to the streets, and I'll go to the extreme and say looting, because they realize that even though they don't have a cause, they can get away with whatever they want at that point because the state is in this state of disarray or disrepair or whatever it could be. And, ultimately what ends up filling that vacuum, and how quickly does it fill before we end up in, as another listener pointed out, the idea of, a post-apocalyptic world minus the zombies. Does it come down at that point to just private property? Does it come back to individual hoarding? What do we end up doing if we're actually depending on people's goodwill working for the common good versus for another actor? How do we get there?
Well, the apocalyptic comment cracks me up, because let me just say that my vision of moving forward is a very classical Marxist communist kind of view, and that is, moving more towards a democratic socialist country like Norway, Sweden, Denmark. They're doing it great. They're doing it fantastic. Much better than we are on almost every index, unless you're talking, the wealthiest tax rate, which I don't consider a viable complaint. So I'm for that first step. I'm for universal basic income. I'm for all of this. And then potentially moving much, much further to the left, towards approaching something that we could call communism. The dynamics of a social change of that magnitude, no one can confidently say that they can predict what's going to happen or that they know human nature. I mean, people love to discuss human nature. People love to say that humans are greedy, but they're also often very, very uninformed as far as evolutionary biology, neurobiology, primatology, anthropology, all of these sciences that contradict that sentiment that humans are greedy and self-centered completely. So I'm not worried about said breakdown of order after property relations change on a massive scale, because what drives people to loot is that they have nothing. So if they have something, people are much less likely to loot. It's definitely a symptom of capitalist mode of production that we're in, that people are as desperate and willing to resort to things like that. So first, it's a much more foundational change. It's getting basic needs to people, basic needs filled for people, and then beyond that, it's experimenting with different social constructions. You know, I mean, there's some very interesting things going on now with universal basic income. You can look at states like Kerala in India, where it's one of the poorest states in India, but it's one of the best as far as healthcare, education, infant mortality, et cetera. So there's different experiments going on. Venezuela, for example, Bolivia, Uruguay. There's lots of different things that we need to look at and we need to learn from in order to institute this. So it's not just this somehow we eradicate the idea of private property completely and then everyone's turned into this Hobbesian nightmare. The fact is that so much of biology and primatology points against that concept.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's obviously going to be any movement towards anything like this, and I mean, we talked about it with the Green New Deal. I mean, anything moving towards that more progressive piece is going to have to be introduced in a way that, again, can be palatable, unless we're recognizing the fact that it's going to be a seismic shift and come with those spillovers. Zach, you should definitely be looking at the Facebook page once this episode airs, because I bet folks are going to have a lot of questions for you to drive further. That's actually
I do my best to not look at Facebook.
Yeah. But for this, I'll find them and send them to you. We'll get them to you one way or the other, so make sure that we get some follow-up there.
If they're as pointed and brilliant as does he wear a helmet and when did he come down with his mental illness question, then I might have to swoop in and see.
Say hi.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support's obviously what keeps us going, and we do appreciate everybody out there for supporting us in these efforts. Subscribing to the show also helps out. You can do that right in the podcast app on the typically it's triangle shape. Word of mouth is our best advertising, and feel free to leave reviews on iTunes especially. If you've got questions, comments, corrections, or just random thoughts you want to share, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page where you can message us, and where we post throughout the week is facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter at Politics Guys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, Will Miller, and Bruce Johnson. This show is produced by Will Miller. We'll be back on Saturday with a new show for you. We hope you'll join us then.